Yet, we don't talk about the kinds of injustices, the human rights abuses, what goes on even along those corridors where migrants move up and down. And this actually is the big elephant in the room as far as I'm concerned.
Jose, do you have an observation on that? Is it a particularly unique challenge that we face today, because there is so many of these scenarios where it's not necessarily open warfare, it's not post-conflict, but there's migrants being driven out, there are large-scale human rights abuses, there are populations being displaced wholly?
Before I answer your question, allow me 30 seconds to acknowledge the presence here of the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in Canberra, the Timor Leste ambassador to Australia, Abel Guterres. A great diplomat, a great human being. Our foreign ministry, even though we are a small country, new, very strict with the amount of time, length of time an ambassador can stay in a country. And because our government, the president, rely a lot on him and trust him and so on. And he knows everyone in Australia, particularly civil society. The other one, a younger diplomat, George Santos, of our Consulate General Office in Sydney. And Kamal Fadel, representative of the people of Western Sahara. And I don't know how many of you in this room would know about Western Sahara. Could be a bit like East Timor. When I first went to New York, and I would tell my favorite little Chinese restaurant waiter in New York, because I would always go to these cheaper places. I said, I'm from East Timor. He would say, oh, you're an Eskimo. And go. So I hope that you know more about Western Sahara than you people in New York knew about East Timor. So having said that, no, what is really extraordinary about these times, 21st century, of instant global communication, interdependency of countries and interests, that some of the conflicts go on with the major powers that be, because of their interests, because of their dependency on a particular country. They allow on, they don't say much at all. I talk about the war in Yemen. The European Union imposed sanctions on Myanmar because of the problem in Rakhine State. They don't say a word about the war in Yemen. Far, far greater scale. The Human Rights Council in Geneva, absolutely active and rightly so on Rakhine State. They hardly say a word about Yemen. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is funding a good part of the Human Rights Council activities. Saudi Arabia even managed to get elected into the Human Rights Council. When this first happened 6 months ago, a year ago, I put something in my page, Facebook, and I said, well, next, the UN is going to elect Imelda Marcos, you're familiar with Imelda Marcos, as chair of a UN commission on corruption in the shoe industry. So my point is to say there are certain limits to pragmatism, to realpolitik. If the European Union, the US, and others, even the Conference of Islamic States, can engage in such blatant double standards, well, then we all undermining completely the multilateral system. So who is going to take seriously?
So if the multilateral system is failing on a question like Yemen, whose job is it to drive resolution?
Yeah. You know, the challenge, the problem in Yemen will come to an end. But, you know, allow me, a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I and Martti Ahtisaari, former president of Finland, we both were guest speakers at the UN in Geneva, at the Palais des Nations. And most questions actually were addressed to me. And that was at the UN. There was like 700 people there. And of course, you were competing with Martti Ahtisaari from attention is not difficult. You know, Martti Ahtisaari, great statesman, diplomat, but being Finnish is extremely low-key. and he was extra cautious in answering questions. Unlike me, you know, so I was asked a question about Syria. And I tell people, sorry, I'm not going to give you a politically correct answer. I'm going to tell you what I feel. That was 5 or 6 years ago. I said, the war in Syria will go on for many, many years. Many tens of thousands more people will die. Let's not pretend that there is going to be a solution. All we have to do is to expand our efforts to look after the refugees, the victims. There are too many parties involved. More than 100 factions within Syria, neighbors who are all involved one way or another, then beyond neighbors, from US to France to UK and so on, and then Russia, which was humiliated in Libya. I don't know if you're familiar with what happened in the background to Syria, when Russia and China made a mistake in allowing a resolution on the concept, the principle of protection, responsibility to protect, meaning civilians, because there were stories about imminent bombing of Benghazi. So a resolution was passed to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi. It turned out to be regime change. And then missiles fired on Gaddafi convoy, killed Gaddafi. Well, Russia and China were not going to do the same mistake with Syria. They wouldn't allow. Russia would not allow another debacle of its policies in Syria. So you have this situation. And then you have the UN, absolutely powerless, almost irrelevant, because when you see the conversations on Syria, who is involved? Who are the actors? US, Russia, Turkey, Iran. And sometimes President Macron of France managed to, like a few days ago, so no easy solution. I'm not, saying. A parallel situation, the Iraq-Iran war in the 80s. Saddam Hussein, sensing weakness in Iraq, in Iran, following the Ayatollah Khomeini revolution, etc., he decided to invade. And of course, the US and others gave tacit agreement, approval to Iraq to invade Iran. Well, the war went on for 8 years. More than 8 million people were killed, 1 million people killed. Chemical, biological weapons were used by Saddam Hussein on Iranians, on Kurdish in the north. But Iran-Iraq war easier to resolve than Syria. Why? You have two organized states, two functioning states. When Saddam Hussein militarily defeated in Iran, ordered the end of hostilities, Khomeini ordered the end of hostilities, they ended. Because these are two organized states. The Syrian state collapsed. So who is making decisions?
So Funmi, as someone that is a proponent of solutions or resolutions being found within communities, is there a function for the domestic populations in a conflict like Yemen or Syria right now to bring about some kind of resolution, or are they not really relevant to the picture given what we've just heard described?
No, because Yemen and Syria, in a sense, are not in that middle state anymore that you talk about, it's more difficult. Those are examples of a multilateral system that is no longer fit for purpose. Why? Because the guardians of that system have, in a sense, abdicated their responsibilities.
You say they, but do you mean the US?
I mean the permanent members of the Security Council, in a sense. The US, in some instances, Russia in other instances. So you can look at Syria, Ukraine, Yemen. You can look across the board and see how they have been complicit. And so this is the crux of it. In Yemen and Syria, we're not going to find any kind of solution at the local level because the nature of the coercive power that's been brought to bear is not one that locals can cope with easily, except to be resilient in their different ways and just try to deal with existential threats under those circumstances. But now, let's get to the crux of the matter in places that are the middle point, that are at the intersection that you talk about. The crux of that matter is local populations are fighting two kinds of battles. Battles with their own local elite, with their governing elite, and battles with the international system. Because what you see is a situation in which, because of the very nature of the interest of the international actors, they have aligned with corrupt, inept, and if you like, unjust local leaders against the interests of the people. What you're likely to find ultimately in the 21st century will be the kinds of protests or the kinds of, the combination of anti-state activities by populations who need to survive in spite of their leaders and in spite of, a less elegant and less well-meaning international community that hides behind old, archaic principles of statehood